Spring 1945. Germany lies in ruins. The Nazi Reich is collapsing. American tanks roll through shattered streets, and behind every door, terrified families wait in silence. Then comes the knock. For 12 years, Nazi propaganda warned them. The Americans are ruthless. They will show no mercy. Now that knock echoes through their homes. Mothers push their children behind them. Elderly hands tremble as they reach for the door. No one knows what happens next. When the door finally opens, what do German civilians say to Patton's conquering army? What you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about the end of World War II. This is not a story about battlefields. This is a story about what was said behind closed doors when the war arrived at people's homes. Spring 1945. Germany lies in ruins. The Nazi Reich is collapsing, and the American tanks roll through shattered streets. And behind every door, terrified families wait in silence. Then comes to the knock. For 12 years, Nazi propaganda warned them. The Americans are ruthless. They will show no mercy. Now that knock echoes through their homes. Mothers push their children behind them. Elderly hands tremble as they reach for the door. No one knows what happens next. When the door finally opens, what do German civilians say to Patton's conquering army? What you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about the end of World War II. This is not a story about battlefields. This is a story about what was said behind closed doors when the war arrived at people's homes. In the spring of 1945, Germany was a nation in its death throes. Cities lay in ruins, roads were shattered, and millions of civilians lived in constant fear. American tanks of General George S. Patton's Third Army rolled through the Rhineland and into Bavaria, moving faster than anyone had anticipated. For German families, the most terrifying sound was no longer explosions in the distance, but the sudden knock on their front door. The war had arrived at their doorstep, and no one knew what would happen next. For 12 years, Nazi propaganda had filled German homes with warnings about the Americans. They were portrayed as ruthless invaders who would show no mercy. By early 1945, as the Eastern Front collapsed and Soviet forces advanced from the east, these fears intensified across Germany. Families heard stories, some true, some exaggerated, of what happened when armies arrived. When American boots echoed on cobblestone streets, civilians faced a terrible uncertainty. Would they be punished for the crimes committed in their nation's name? Would they be protected? Would they even survive the encounter? Patton's Third Army pushed rapidly through Germany in those final months. Soldiers walked street by street, knocking on doors, searching for weapons, Nazi officials, and intelligence. For civilians, the war was no longer something discussed on the radio or written in newspapers. It had arrived at their homes. Behind every door was a story. Some hid Nazi officials desperate to escape justice. Others sheltered refugees fleeing from the east. But most contained exhausted families simply trying to survive. Germany at this time was physically and spiritually exhausted. Years of total war had stripped homes of basic necessities. Food was scarce, ration systems had collapsed, and homes were damaged beyond repair. Windows were shattered, roofs leaked, and many families burned furniture for warmth. Most civilians were not soldiers or party leaders. They were parents trying to protect their children, elderly people struggling to survive, and families simply hoping the war would end without more loss. And this was not the prosperous Reich that propaganda had promised, but a society that had consumed itself. When the knocks came, many doors opened slowly. Behind them were pale faces and shaking hands. Civilians often raised their hands instinctively, a gesture learned from newsreels and rumors. Mothers positioned themselves in front of children. Elderly residents sometimes offered whatever valuables remained: watches, silverware, family heirlooms, hoping to buy safety. American soldiers later remembered the eyes they saw, eyes filled with fear, confusion, and exhaustion. These were not the eyes of enemies ready to fight, but of people who had already lost everything. The first words spoken were often quiet and careful. Many civilians simply said, "Bitte," meaning please. Others repeated, "Nicht Nazi," not Nazi, hoping to distance themselves from the regime. Some asked for food. Some asked for mercy. Others said nothing at all. Very few showed anger. Most only showed fear and uncertainty about their future. Mothers often stepped forward first, placing themselves between the soldiers and their children. They did not speak about politics or the Nazi government. They spoke about hunger, safety, and survival. Their concern was not ideology, it was life. Inside the homes, American soldiers saw a reality that defied wartime propaganda. Cupboards were empty. Rooms were cold. Furniture was broken. There were no signs of wealth or celebration, only the marks of years of war. Many soldiers, some barely out of their teens, found themselves in an uncomfortable role. They were conquerors, liberators, and occupiers simultaneously. Some approached these encounters with suspicion, others with sympathy, most with a mixture of both. Many realized that these civilians were not the enemy. The true enemy had been the war itself. Communication happened through broken phrases and desperate gestures. Few civilians spoke English, and few soldiers spoke German. Conversations were made through gestures, expressions, and silence. Civilians produced documents, pointed to photos of dead relatives in Wehrmacht uniforms, or claimed ignorance of concentration camps and atrocities. These claims created moral dilemmas for soldiers. How could millions have known nothing? Yet the fear in their voices seemed genuine. Whether those claims were true or not, the fear was real. The line between complicity and survival was not always clear. Fear of punishment was common. Civilians repeatedly asked what would happen to them. They feared revenge, imprisonment, or death. Many insisted they had no choice, that they had simply tried to survive under a brutal regime. History would later judge these claims, but in those moments, survival was their only concern. Not all civilians showed only fear. Some displayed shame, a quiet acknowledgement that something terrible had happened, even if they claimed no direct responsibility. Others maintained defiance, insisting Germany had been wronged. Many simply shut down emotionally, unable to process the collapse of everything they had known. Unexpectedly, moments of kindness followed. American soldiers shared chocolate, bread, and cigarettes. For children, these small gifts felt unbelievable. For adults, they brought a sense of relief. Some soldiers found elderly civilians who reminded them of their own grandparents. Others discovered civilians who had hidden Jews or opposed the regime quietly. In those moments, the image of the enemy began to change. On both sides, these interactions complicated the clear moral narrative of war. The enemy was supposed to be monstrous, but behind these doors were people who looked exhausted, defeated, and human. Reactions varied from home to home. Some civilians felt relief that the fighting was over. Others felt shame for what had been done in their country's name. Some remained silent, unsure how to feel. Many civilians quickly hid any connection to the Nazi Party. Uniforms disappeared. Badges were removed. The same regime that once demanded loyalty was now denied. Survival had replaced ideology. The most difficult encounters involved those who had clearly benefited from the Nazi system: party officials, SS families, or those who had enriched themselves through Aryanization. Their denials rang hollow, but Patton's forces followed procedure: document, detain, and let military tribunals decide. Again and again, civilians described themselves as ordinary people. They said they were not leaders or decision-makers. They were workers, parents, and neighbors caught in forces beyond their control. The war may have ended, but its emotional weight remained heavy. One question echoed across Germany: Wann ist es vorbei? When will it be over? Civilians asked it, wondering when they could return to normal life, not understanding that normal no longer existed. Soldiers asked it, wondering when they could go home. Both groups were caught in the exhausting aftermath of total war. Patton's army followed strict orders. Discipline was enforced. Looting was punishable by court-martial. Violence against civilians was prohibited. Patton believed the war must end with order, not chaos. Even in victory, control mattered. This discipline served both practical and strategic purposes, maintaining military effectiveness while demonstrating American values. However, Patton's personal views were complex. He saw Germans as a defeated enemy to be controlled, not friends to be comforted. Years later, American soldiers who participated in the occupation remembered those door-to-door encounters more than the battles. They remembered the faces, the silence, and the fear behind each door. Some felt they had witnessed genuine suffering. Others remained skeptical of German innocence. Many struggled with the moral complexity of treating recent enemies with basic humanity. These moments stayed with them long after the war was over. For German civilians, these encounters marked the beginning of a long reckoning. The knock on the door was not just about immediate survival. It was the first moment when the consequences of the Nazi regime became personal and unavoidable. World War II was not only fought on battlefields, it was fought inside homes, in kitchens, and behind closed doors. When Patton's army knocked on German doors, they found neither monsters nor saints, but people caught in the machinery of history. The conversations that happened in those doorways, halting, fearful, and uncertain, remind us that war's end is not the same as peace. Real peace requires confronting uncomfortable truths about complicity, about survival, about the distance between propaganda and reality. These moments behind German doors in 1945 were not neat or simple. They were messy, morally complex, and deeply human. When Patton's army knocked, German civilians spoke, not as enemies, but as human beings, and their words remind us that war is never just history. It is human.